The significance of Mary Magdalene in the story of Jesus. The role of Mary Magdalene in the four Gospels has been examined by many scholars and religious historians. Her personal relationship with Jesus has been discussed, and finally, other than her representation as the 13th disciple, there has been rumors of her having a relationship with Jesus, where one source even claims that she is the mother of his children, which most have discussed as speculation. Instead of looking to mankind for her role in the Gospels, her significance can be enlightened by considering her purpose in terms of a divine reason why Mary Magdalene is in the life of Jesus and represented in the four Gospels. Mary Magdalene's name appears repeatedly in the Gospels. She is either with Mary, the mother of Jesus, or other women such as Mary, the mother of James the Less, of Jose and Salome. There is a distinct purpose and place for Mary Magdalene in Jesus' life. In this essay, her portrayal in the New Testament, the explication of the verses where her name is mentioned, and the rhetorical devices used will be examined to demonstrate how they contribute to her role as one of the most significant individuals in the New Testament in the story of Jesus. One way to approach this aspect of the meaning of Mary Magdalene's place in the Gospels is to inspect the use of the rhetorical devices in the passages of the four Gospels where Mary Magdalene appears, and to examine her role in the narratives. Why did her name appear in the Gospels more than other women, placing her only second to Mary, the mother of Jesus, who is mentioned 18 times in the four Gospels and once in the Acts of the Apostles? Mary Magdalene was mentioned 14 times between the Gospels. These readings were closely analyzed and the results were found to be consistent between them. Mary Magdalene appears in all of the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, called the Synoptic Gospels because the stories are sometimes in the same order. She appears in each one of the Gospels with a 2-verse introductory statement, and except for the Gospel of Luke, each one has a long narrative about the events that led to Mary Magdalene's discovery of Jesus' body missing from the tomb, which will be referred to as the tomb passages. The 2 verses that introduce Mary Magdalene in the Bible begin with a calm tone. These passages are followed by 19 verses that lead up to the dramatic death of Jesus, and finally the scene where Mary Magdalene is at the tomb. In the introductory passages, she is a woman who always appears with other women, but as the narrative continues, she is the only woman who is named repeatedly. As the narrative progresses, her importance magnifies. The stories are very similar, with some slight changes, but the message is the same. The rhetorical devices increase, along with the escalation of the narrative leading to the discovery of the missing body of Jesus. And finally, to the revelation by Mary Magdalene that Jesus has been resurrected from the dead. For example, in the Gospel of Matthew, the name of Mary Magdalene appears for the first time in verse 56 of chapter 27, and it is one of the first rhetorical devices mentioned by E.W. Bullinger, which is referred to as polysyndeton, and it is recognized in the previous verse 55 by the use of the word and. It also denotes the standard introduction used in the 3 Gospels by placing her with other women. And many women who followed Jesus from Galilee, ministering to him, were there looking from afar. Along with the word and, the use of the conjunction but and so are repeated in verse 61. In chapter 28, the conjunctions are also used in verses 5, 7, 8, and 9 at the beginning of the verse and inserted between the lines. For example, the words and for in Matthew 28:5 are in the middle of the sentence. But the angel answered and said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for know that you seek Jesus who was crucified." The lines in between these verses are connected by the use of the preposition that reflects time, as demonstrated with the word now, Matthew 28:1. The last verse depicting Matthew's story of Mary Magdalene begins with the word then. The conjunctions slow down the reader, while the use of the prepositions connect the narrative when the verses are read consecutively. This device of polysyndeton is exhibited throughout the other three Gospels in both of the introductory and the tomb passages. Additionally, the introductory verses, there are words and phrases that denote time, and according to Leland Riker in the Dictionary of Biblical Imagery, these words represent more than simply just one meaning. Now, after the Sabbath, as the first day of the week began to dawn, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to see the tomb. Matthew 28:1. The early morning or dawn means new beginnings, and according to Riker, dawn is the time when the pulse of life reasserts itself. Also, the word ministering is used in reference to Mary Magdalene and the other women who were followers of Jesus. However, it does not specify ministering to other people, but to Jesus himself. And many women who followed Jesus from Galilee, ministering to him, were there looking from afar. Matthew 27:55. Also, according to Riker, the definition of the word minister is a minister or someone who ministers can be viewed as having the traditional role of a priest or minister, but the other meanings for the word can be applied to Mary Magdalene and the other women. A person who ministers can also be described as demonstrating a dedicated type of love for God and therefore being in God's favor. The women, especially Mary Magdalene, have a deep love for Jesus and are true followers of him, matching this definition. In this last definition Riker uses for minister, it relates even closer to the meaning of the women in the Gospels, but especially Mary Magdalene. Riker states, nevertheless, God chooses to use human ministers to represent him. Jesus named his followers my witnesses. From Acts also, echoing Isaiah's words also from God to his people who minister to him in Isaiah 43:10. This special role of Mary Magdalene and the women as followers and witnesses is repeated throughout the four Gospels, and the meaning of the words strengthens the narrative along with the rhetorical devices. In the Gospel of Mark, a different approach to the introductory passage of Mary Magdalene demonstrates another rhetorical device of Bullinger's called synthesis, which is used to repeat a phrase, but in a different way. There were also women looking on from afar, among whom was Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James the Less, and Jose and Salome, and who also followed him and ministered to him when he was in Galilee, and many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem. This is Mark 15:40. Mark begins his sentence with there instead of and, as used in the Gospel of Matthew. In this example, Matthew says, and many women who followed Jesus from Galilee ministering to him were there looking from afar. Matthew 27:55. However, Matthew continues to change the whole phrase, putting the words in different order and reversing the phrase. The women looking on from afar places the phrase at the end of the sentence, and Jesus from Galilee is at the beginning of the sentence. This device is called synthesis. It brings special attention to each word to establish Mary Magdalene as an important figure for the reader in the Gospels of both Matthew and Mark. The Gospels of Luke and John introduce Mary Magdalene and the women with a different perspective. And certain women who had been healed of evil spirits and infirmities, Mary called Magdalene, out of whom had come 7 demons, from Luke 8:2. Luke describes the women, particularly Mary Magdalene, as having been healed by Jesus and having evil spirits. John's introduction to the women also places Mary Magdalene last and has her listed with a different group of women. Now, they're stood by the cross of Jesus, his mother, and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene, John 19:25. In this verse, John places Mary Magdalene into a specified position or relationship with his mother and mother's sister, or aunt, and she's regarded as family. These women remain with Mary Magdalene, But in her last appearance, Mary Magdalene is given the honor of being in the scene all by herself. She discovers the stone was rolled away, establishing her importance in the narrative. The escalation of the narrative continues, and the rhetorical devices magnify and increase in number and emphasis to reach a climax with the use of hyperbole and the emphasis of the action. As the gradual use of polysyndeton increases with the use of the words and, the drama increases. This process of escalation is a device called anapasis by Bullinger. The Gospel of Mark demonstrates anapasis, which eventually leads to a firm statement that has three devices used in combination. He who believes and is baptized will be saved, but he who does not believe will be condemned. Mark 16:16. One of the devices is called Eleutheria, and it is used for the candor or shocking type of statement. The statement, however, is also judgmental, and that device is called epicresis. The last rhetorical device is anastasis, which shows two contrary statements within one statement by reporting that the person who believes will be saved. However, the person who does not believe will not be saved. In the next two verses, these statements are declared as fact, although they are shocking again to the reader because not only can the believers cast out demons and speak with new tongues, but they will take up serpents, and if they drink anything deadly, it will be by no means hurt them. They will lay hands on the sick, and they will recover. From Mark 16:18. The believers will have the power of Jesus and have the capability of healing others, performing miracles, using the rhetorical devices of Eleutherius again. Now, one of the most dramatic rhetorical devices is echophonetius, which is the use of exclamations. And as they went to tell his disciples, behold, Jesus met them, saying, rejoice, Matthew 28:9. The Gospel of Mark also uses exclamation marks to state the resurrection of Jesus. He is risen, Mark 16:6. But in the last Gospel, Jesus reveals himself to Mary Magdalene. Mary, she turned and said to him, Rabboni, John 16:16. In this emotional reunion where it appears that she tried to hug him, Jesus responds, do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father. John 20:17. The last use of echophonetius has elevated the conversation in the narrative with Jesus and Mary Magdalene, explaining their names to each other. Then Mary Magdalene's obedience is demonstrated as she awaits the instructions of Jesus. At this point in the narrative, not only does the excitement of Jesus' return attract the reader, but the most important role of Mary Magdalene's ministry is revealed to her by Jesus as he gives her these instructions. But go to my brethren and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, and to my God and your God. John 20:17. In the next verse, she carries out his instructions. Mary Magdalene came and told the disciples that she had seen the Lord and that he had spoke these things to her. John 20:18. Mary Magdalene's position in the narrative has elevated from a woman among other women to a woman who encounters and then discloses the miracle of the resurrected Jesus, the Son of God. The climax of the four Gospels is not the drama of the crucifixion, but the resurrection of Jesus, and therefore the reason that Mary Magdalene has been placed in the life of Jesus and had a role in the four Gospels is not to just call attention to the passion and the crucifixion of Jesus, but to proclaim God's glory in his risen Son, Jesus Christ. Although Mary Magdalene has been the subject of rumors and speculation about her relationship to Jesus, the only direct connection that she can be made to Jesus is by examining the four Gospels, is the important role that Jesus gave her after he is risen. The four Gospels of the New Testament describe the story of Mary Magdalene, but the rhetorical devices aid in enhancing her significance in the Bible. In the beginning of the story of Mary Magdalene, her introductory chapters place her with the family and followers of Jesus. But by the end of the dramatic narrative of the tomb passages, Mary Magdalene has fulfilled her most important function and earned her place in the Bible as a special messenger and minister to and for Jesus to proclaim that he has risen from the dead. Thank you.
I'm going to be talking about Christian rhetoric and thought in Orderic Vitails' Historia Ecclesiastica. At the end of the first quarter of the 12th century, at the Norman Benedictine monastery of Saint-Roule, an Anglo-Norman monk named Orderic Vitails began writing his ambitious historiographical project, a history of the Christian Church, from the birth of Christ to his own times, which is called Historia Ecclesiastica. In his work, he wrote on the ecclesiastical and political history of Christendom, but focused on events in Normandy and in his native England, and paid particular attention to the history of his own abbey. In one particularly interesting narrative moment, Orderic includes a miraculous story told by a former abbot of his monastery, named Finney, and renders the story in Finney's direct speech. The story tells of a young monk whose work as a scribe and copyist saved his soul, and it emphasizes the devotional efficacy and exculpatory power of joint oral literate activities within the medieval monastery. In this story, Orderic also includes quotations from the Apostle Paul's letter to the Ephesians and his second letter to Timothy, as well as from Augustine's treatise, De Doctrina Christiana, on Christian teaching. In this paper, I will show how Orderic contextualizes the story with Finney's own background and use biblical and patristic quotation to set Finney up as an example of the Pauline and Augustinian ideals of a Christian teacher and rhetorician. I will also explore how Orderic emphasizes the importance of oral literate activity for the divine service, and then actually creates interactions of morality and literacy within the written history itself, particularly in using Finney's direct speech. Examining this narrative moment demonstrates how Orderic included intersections of morality and literacy in his history by creating a moment of Christian teaching, using and incorporating principles of Christian thought to elevate and strengthen his history. The story Orderic included in his history was told by Abbot Finney to the young monks he taught, quote, urging them repeatedly to avoid mental sloth which could harm body and soul alike, end quote. The story concerns a monk whose work as a scribe eventually saved his soul. Orderic renders the story in Finney's voice, presenting it through direct speech to lend it greater authority and presence within the text. The story is noteworthy because it is fundamentally concerned with the spiritual benefits of writing and copying, and also as a reproduction of orality within the text that becomes an exemplary moment of Christian teaching. The full story that Finney gives is worth quoting at length, and I've got it on your handout as well if you want to follow along. In a certain monastery there dwelt a brother who had committed almost every possible sin against the monastic rule. But he was a scribe, devoted to his work, who had of his own free will completed a huge volume of the divine law. After his death, his soul was brought for judgment before the throne of the just judge. Whilst the evil spirits accused him vehemently, bringing forward all his many sins, the holy angel showed in his defense the book that he had written in the house of God, and the letters in the huge book were carefully weighed one by one against his sins. In the end, one letter alone remained in excess of all the sins, and the demons tried in vain to find any fault to weigh against it. So the judge in his mercy spared this brother, and allowed his soul to return to his body for a little while, so that he might amend his life. Bear this in mind, my dearest brethren. Cleanse your heart of all vain and sinful desires, and offer the works of your hands to the Lord God as a never-ceasing sacrifice. Strive constantly to avoid sloth as deadly poison, for as our Holy Father Benedict says, idleness is the enemy of the soul. I'm going to skip ahead a little here. Follow the counsel of Solomon and keep your heart unspotted from the world, striving with all your might to do the will of God. Pray, read, chant psalms, write, persevere with such things, and consciously arm yourselves with them against the wiles of the devil. Orderic finishes his story by saying, quote, with such words as these, Finney used to teach his pupils, and by reproving, rebuking, and exhorting, encourage them to a good life, himself setting an example by prayer and such good works as copying books, end quote. Thus, Orderic presents a story that emphasizes the exculpatory and exemplary power of literacy through the medium of the spoken words of his oral source. Theory's address is a seamless blend of story, speech, and sermon that uses Theory's voice through direct speech to impart authority onto the moral lesson of the monk whose scribing saved his soul. With this, Orderic creates an intersection of morality and literacy by rendering the spoken word in the written text. He emphasizes in the moral of the story the spiritual benefits of joint oral literate activity to worship God and ward off evil temptations, both because the monk's scribal work literally saved his soul, and in Theory's exhortation to pray, read, chant psalms, and write. The aspects of this story that I will emphasize in this paper are Theory's concerns with the spiritual benefits of scribing and copying, Theory's and Orderic's use of biblical quotation, and the importance of Orderic's replicating Theory's voice in telling the story. Orderic contextualizes this story by writing about Theory's own impressive work as a scribe and the benefits his labor brought about on behalf of the monastery, as an illustration of how scribing builds character. Orderic calls Theory the man of God, a man worthy of respect and emulation. Orderic lists the qualities that made him such an excellent abbot, writing of Theory that, desiring the joys of contemplation, he delegated administrative duties as far as possible, and gave himself up wholeheartedly to the divine service. He was always at his prayers, and performed the manual work that was proper for him. Being a brilliant philosopher, he left to the young monks of Sonnebrühl some worthy monuments of his skill. In the combined acts of reading, praying, working, and copying, Orderic presents Theory as an example of the monk devoted to the service of God and the abbey. The manual work that was proper for him refers to the rule of Saint Benedict, as Sonnebrühl was a Benedictine abbey, which required daily labor for all monks. By Orderic's time, interpretation of the rule allowed for certain monks to perform their manual labor, not by toiling in the fields, but by scribing, copying, and decorating manuscripts. The monuments that Theory left to the monastery through his manual labor, as well as other works copied by some of his fellow monks, included liturgical books, works on divine law, a heptateuch, commentaries, and some of Gregory's dialogues. During the 8 years of his abbacy, Theory oversaw the task of copying some of the most essential books of any Benedictine library, such as, to quote Orderic, the Old and New Testaments and the complete works of Pope Gregory the Great, and the treatises of Jerome and Augustine, Ambrose and Isidore, Eusebius and Orosius, and other fathers. Orderic considers Theory's endeavors in copying to be both the result of his excellent character and the most important contribution to his tenure and legacy as abbot. In such an enumeration of the works copied at the abbey and the scribes who copied them, Orderic demonstrates the respect he had for such scribal endeavors and the good works brought about through the labor of copying, not only in providing sacred texts for the abbey, but also in setting an example for other monks of the spiritual benefits brought about through copying as an aspect of divine contemplation. Orderic writes that the example of such scribes who filled the library at Sonnebrühl with indispensable patristic works was inspirational to young monks engaged in the same work, a sentiment derived perhaps from Orderic's own experiences and interests as a monk of Sonnebrühl actively engaged with and interested in the activities of writing. To Orderic, copying was more than a manual task necessary to build up an impressive library. It was itself part of the divine service, and allowed the scribe to meditate on the words of the sacred texts and divine laws he read and wrote. Monastic education created a joint oral literate context of learning and worship, such as in teaching young monks to pronounce words while they read to create a visual and oral memory of the words. This education aimed for literacy to fulfill devotional obligations, and young monks were taught to read and write so that they could memorize, recite, and sing the liturgy, because the fundamental purpose of monastic literacy was to realize the worship of God. Orderic's attitude towards the purpose and spiritual benefits of copying sets the tone for Theory's story. In discussing Theory's moral character through the lens of the books he copied, Orderic provides a ready example of how scribal work develops virtue. The moral value of the story is that the free engagement in the copying of holy texts is an aspect of the divine service is the soul-saving effort. Orderic emphasizes this moral by presenting it in the voice of the very person who best exemplifies such an ideal. Thus, Orderic sets Theory up as an example of the spiritual benefits of scribing, and then creates a narrative moment by using Theory's direct speech that becomes a moment of teaching and exhorting. The aim of Christian teaching was to be able to speak with authority and eloquence, deriving from an intimate knowledge of the scriptures and other authoritative Christian literature. St. Augustine writes in Book 4 of his De Doctrina Christiana that it is through the process of speaking that the Christian teacher must, quote, communicate what is good and eradicate what is bad, end quote. Augustine underscores the role and authority of speech in Christian instruction because the majority of teaching takes place through speech. In light of this, he emphasizes the necessity for speech to be powerful and eloquent due to the high purpose it serves, and discusses the risk that unintelligent, boring, and awkward speech becomes a detriment to the learning of the listeners. In speaking, the teacher should demonstrate his knowledge of the scriptures, usually through quoting them, and always in a way that reveals a profound understanding of the meaning of the words. In peppering his speech with quotation, the teacher can utilize the eloquence of the scriptures to teach the listeners, to delight them with words, and to move them to righteous living. Understanding Augustine's basic and fundamental ideals for Christian teaching provides context for reading and analyzing narrative moments in Orderic's history, such as Theory's story, that make use of these ideals. Orderic uses biblical quotation both in his own analysis of Theory's story and in Theory's direct speech to set Theory up in the text as an exemplary Christian teacher. Theory's final words in the story, quote, pray, read, chant psalms, write, persevere with such things, and consciously arm yourselves with them against the wiles of the devil, unquote, echo the Apostle Paul's letter to the Ephesians, in which Paul urges them to put on the armor of God that they might be able to resist the temptations of the devil. Orderic's use of the armor metaphor emphasizes the efficacy of reading and writing as spiritual defenses against the forces of evil that Orderic saw active in the world. It presents praying, reading, chanting, and writing as offensive aids in the moral development of the monk. All four activities involve the interaction of orality and literacy and grew from the monastic education system that emphasized the use of literacy for oral worship. In Theory's story, the literate activity of the sinful monk saves his soul, and Theory emphasizes how such scribal work, as well as praying and chanting, serves a spiritual purpose in fundamentally contributing to the divine service, but also in thwarting the temptations that arise from idleness. In quoting Ephesians, Theory demonstrates his knowledge and understanding of the scriptures, and underscores his own oral moment of Christian teaching with the soundness of sacred text. Orderic therefore presents the spiritual benefits of such activities involving the interaction of orality and literacy in a story that emphasizes the spiritual benefits of literate activity, and itself forms an interaction of orality and literacy through Theory's spoken words rendered in a written text, with these spoken words then further utilizing the written text of the Bible. Orderic's use of Paul's armor metaphor is not content that just any activity involving the interaction of orality and literacy is spiritually beneficial. The specific activities of praying, reading, chanting, and writing are all concerned with divine contemplation and the engagement with sacred texts. The combined efforts of oral, aural, and visual meditation upon sacred texts effectively develop the character and virtue of a monk in complementary ways, as Orderic demonstrates by contextualizing the story with Theory's own experiences as described. Theory's apt reference to the Pauline epistle thus serves a purpose in emphasizing the role of these activities in monastic development. It also serves to demonstrate Theory's capacity as a Christian teacher according to Augustinian and Pauline principles. In accordance with Augustine's standard of using biblical quotation, Theory uses Paul's language to demonstrate his profound understanding of the scriptures and to utilize the metaphorical eloquence of the Bible in order to elevate his own teaching. This demonstrates Theory's capacity as a Christian teacher, as well as his joint oral literate use of sacred text. The quotation itself, at the same time that it is being used to elevate speech, simultaneously refers his audience, similarly familiar with the language of the scriptures, to the source of his allusion, providing a source for his metaphor and thus a greater context of understanding. Orderic's quotation of 2 Timothy 4:2, in saying that Theory was reproving, rebuking, and exhorting in his analysis of Theory's story, echoes Augustine's De Doctrina Christiana, Book 4, in which Augustine uses the same quotation from Paul's second letter to Timothy as a preeminent example of Christian teaching. Augustine writes that the purpose of Christian rhetoric is to accomplish these purposes of reproving, rebuking, and exhorting, to teach an audience scriptural truth, to delight them with biblical eloquence through quotation, and to move them to righteous living. In using this reference, Orderic presents theory as the exemplar and employer of true Christian rhetoric, utilized for instruction, correction, and encouragement. In quoting De Doctrina Christiana and Paul's letter to Timothy, which concerns Christian teaching, in relation to how theory presented his own teaching, Orderic demonstrates that theory conforms to a correct model of how a Christian teacher should speak. Orderic uses quotations not only to elevate theory's speech and heighten his eloquence, but also to implicitly state to the reader, through the means of allusion, that theory's story is an ideal and correct example of what content Christian teaching promulgates, what qualities Christian teaching emphasizes, and in what manner a Christian teacher speaks. I will now turn to the final concern of this paper and consider the importance of Orderic's rendering of this story into theory's direct speech. By presenting the story and its moral in theory's direct speech, Orderic creates a narrative moment in which theory teaches, and he uses a quotation in theory's teaching to refer the reader back to Scripture and to elevate theory's eloquence in teaching. But the crux of the matter is that Orderic rendered the story in theory's voice. Because of the emphasis on speaking as the most effective medium of Christian teaching, Orderic needed to tell the story in theory's voice so that it could be a moment of Christian teaching and so that he could present theory as an exemplary Christian teacher. By using theory's direct speech, Orderic demonstrated theory's ability as a teacher to utilize Scripture, speak with Christian eloquence, and accomplish the purposes of Christian rhetoric through the words he spoke. Thus, in using theory's voice, Orderic replicates Christian teaching and rhetoric in ways that he could not if he had merely reported theory's speech indirectly. In presenting the story in theory's direct speech, Orderic creates a moment of speaking and teaching in his written text. He creates an intersection of morality and literacy by using the voice of the speaker in his text and at a narrative moment that is fundamentally concerned with the spiritual benefits gained through joint oral literate activity in the divine service. Orderic's use of theory's voice compounds this concern through creating a moment of oral teaching that quotes written sacred texts. In this teaching moment, theory emphasizes the benefits of scribal engagement that his own background demonstrates and does so through Christian teaching elevated by scriptural truth, revealing through biblical understanding the veracity of the words he says. It is through speaking that theory makes all this manifest, and it is through replicating theory's direct speech that Orderic can impart the same truths and manifestations into his own text. In conclusion, Orderic uses the miraculous story in his history to create intersections of morality and literacy in the text that revolve around the exemplary and exculpatory power of scribing and copying texts as aspects of divine worship. The intersections operate at various levels within the text, from the level of the scribe in the story whose literate work saves his soul, to the level of the speaker theory, whose voice Orderic utilizes to create a moment of teaching that would have been unapproachable without the use of direct speech. Orderic uses theory's voice to present him as an ideal and correct Christian teacher. He uses biblical and patristic quotation in order to elevate his speech and to demonstrate his qualification as a Christian teacher who correctly employs the ideals of Christian rhetoric in order to instruct, to correct, and to move and persuade his audience. By emphasizing theory's work as a scribe and copyist in the development of the monastery, and then by placing the narrative moment in theory's actual voice, Orderic uses a speaker who emulates the qualities he encourages and creates a narrative moment that accomplishes the Augustinian ideal of rhetoric. He utilizes biblical quotation to refer the reader to the very works that establish and reinforce theory's qualifications as a Christian teacher, and demonstrates theory's skillful appropriation of true Christian rhetoric. With the inclusion of this moment within his history, Orderic is able to claim theory's authority as a source within his work. He uses theory's eloquent teaching within the greater narrative framework of his history to infuse his history with the learning, eloquence, and understanding of a great Christian teacher. And finally, he uses the story to emphasize the importance of engaging in oral and literate activities to spiritually benefit the soul and ward off temptation in order to expound and parallel to his own purpose in writing history. Thank you.
Apologies for the delay. So this is Fortune, Friend, and Foe, the case for a new modern English translation of Summer Sunday. This paper offers a new modern English translation of the medieval poem Summer Sunday, as an avenue to introduce non-specialist readers, such as high school and university students, to the influence on medieval thought by the concept of the goddess Fortune, as well as the tradition established by the constellation of philosophy, constellation from here on out, by Boethius. Summer Sunday is a 133-line narrative poem of the chanson d'aventure type written in a West Midland dialect of Middle English, most likely during the mid-14th century. The poet huntsman wanders off into the woods where he has a waking vision of the goddess Fortune. A new modern English translation can offer a more accurate portrayal of the poem's narrative and bring renewed attention to its significance for medieval studies. While Boethius' profound impact on medieval philosophy, art, and literature is well known among medievalists, outside of the specialist halls of academia, he's virtually unknown. Boethius was the most influential thinker throughout the Middle Ages. Henry Chadwick declares Boethius as, quote, this last Roman who transmitted a whole cultural world to his medieval successors, end quote. While his translation and treatises had significant effects on philosophical thought through the 12th century, the Consolation had even greater ranging and longer-lasting impact on medieval literature. Boethius was a Roman political servant in late antiquity, and sometime after 522 CE, he was charged as a traitor to the ruling political regime, imprisoned, tortured, and later killed. Written during his imprisonment, the Consolation introduces Boethius' fictional yet philosophical dialogue with Lady Philosophy, in which he laments his imprisonment. Lady Philosophy offers her rhetorical remedy, that Fortune's worldly goods are transitory and that only God is eternal and essential to happiness. An abundance of allusions to Boethius' Consolation and the goddess Fortune exists throughout medieval and Renaissance art and literature. The medieval scholar Howard Rowland Hatch provides a nearly exhaustive representation of the sheer quantity of references to the goddess along with her characteristics. Several of the most well-known writers of the Middle Ages, including Dante, Boccaccio, and Chaucer, owe tremendous debts to the Consolation. The Summer Sunday Poet is another of these, and the poem underscores a variety of characteristics common to medieval literature that make it ideal for inclusion in any course of medieval literature. John Gardner highlights how the poem, quote, makes brilliant use of old conventions, the hunt, the dream vision, the wheel of fortune scene, end quote. Summer Sunday is emblematic of some of the best attributes of medieval literary works. The poem shines a light on the goddess Fortune, much as a character sketch might do. She just made it darker and I can't see. The poem shines a light on the goddess Fortune, much as a character sketch might do. Because of the brevity and simplicity of its design, it offers an uncomplicated view of her character that can be used as a heuristic for interpreting other medieval works that feature her, whether as a corporeal entity or embodied in other characters by means of allegory. In addition to acting as an exemplar of the goddess Fortune in medieval literature, Summer Sunday is a rich medieval poem artfully constructed in rhyming alliterative verse. Gardner declares the poem, quote, one of the most beautiful lyrics in Middle English, end quote. Susanna Fine calls attention to the poem's hyper-alliteration that, together with interlocking rhyme, repetition, and concatenation, quote, creates a tumbling effect which vividly conveys a sensation of the wheel in motion, end quote. While medieval specialists can easily enjoy the literary and poetic excellence of Summer Sunday, its particular dialect of Middle English is far more challenging for most readers than Chaucer's more familiar London dialect. So few people outside of academia have been exposed to the poem. Struck by the elegance and relevance of the work, I felt compelled to bring it forward to be admired and studied by non-specialists. Only one modern English translation of the poem exists in print, that by Gardner in the alliterative Mort Arthur, The Owl and the Nightingale, and 5 other Middle English poems in a modernized version, 1971. While many of Gardner's choices present as reasonable and faithful to the meaning of the poem, there are several instances in which he veers from the most likely meanings illuminated in the context of the original manuscript. For example, his version of the poem skips entirely line 125 of the original with seemingly no explanation. In his notes, Gardner admits, quote, "In the short line sequences midway through the poem, repetition becomes so complex as to defy translation," end quote. Regardless of any reason for the omission, it adds to the appropriateness of providing a new version of the poem. The most concerning areas of Gardner's translation are related to his portrayal of the goddess and her wheel, which differs somewhat from the predominant tradition. The constellation was largely responsible for the popularization of Fortune in medieval literature, and most, if not all, depictions of her that came afterwards follow the portrait of her painted by Boethius's words. Lady Philosophy enumerates Fortune's gifts, including riches, honors, power, and fame. Fortune is described as a two-faced creature that blesses men with success as easily as she dooms them with failure. The poet Huntsman's description of her in Summer Sunday is similar. She's beautiful in front, but ugly in back, literally two-faced. But Gardner skips over this distinction in line 56. The original describes her as, quote, "so fairly fair of face to fore," end quote. And Gardner translates this as "so strangely fair her face," even though the Middle English word to fore clearly indicates the intended emphasis of in front. This short phrase can add powerfully to the poem's illustrative effect. In Summer Sunday, conventional descriptions of Fortune's wheel demonstrate an awareness of the medieval tradition surrounding the goddess. Frequently, she is associated with the tragedy of a character falling from a high to a low place, whether in terms of position, wealth, or affect. In the constellation, Lady Philosophy pretends to speak as Fortune and sums up the crux of her modus operandi. Quote, "Here is the source of my power, the game I always play. I spin my wheel and find pleasure in raising the low to a high place and lowering those who were on top," end quote. In line 34 of Summer Sunday, the poet Huntsman introduces Fortune as a whiffman with a wonder well, weaver with the wind. A woman with a wondrous wheel, moving to and fro with the wind. Significantly, Gardner translates the latter part of this line as wound by the wind. But a crucial aspect of the nature of the goddess Fortune is lost with this interpretation. For the wheel to be turned by the wind removes Fortune's agency as it has long been understood. Patch describes the wheel as the most significant symbol associated with the goddess, with 4 kings on it in various states. On the left, one of aspiration, at the top, achievement, to the right, failure, and at the bottom of the wheel, powerlessness. Patch named this pattern the formula of 4, which is frequently associated with the Wheel of Fortune in medieval art and literature. In the most typical style of such medieval artwork, the 4 kings are shown riding the wheel with speech ascribed to each. Regno, regnavi, sumsine regno, and regnavo. I reign, I reigned, I am without reign, and I will reign. The Summer Sunday poet's deliberate choice to allow the king to speak about his condition imitates this pattern and acts as the centerpiece of the poem. The tale is told to the poet Huntsman by the king as he rides the wheel, presents a powerful visual for understanding the consequences of Fortune's influence on men's lives. In addition to the shared view of Fortune's nature, the expression "with the wind" can be understood to mean in the direction in which the wind is blowing. And a typical veering wind in Britain in summer would move in a clockwise direction. Such an understanding supports the decision to add the word clockwise to my version of this line of the poem. Finally, a now obsolete meaning of wind as a noun is of a witch, which is a device for cranking and would still require that fortune operated to turn the wheel. These alternate interpretations for the phrase with the wind have a pivotal effect on the visual representation of the goddess achieved by the poem. Even though my entire endeavor here contests Gardner's effort at translating Summer Sunday, I have recognized a kindred spirit in the scholar and poet who saw value in the same work that has captured my interest and who wanted to share it with readers outside of the medieval academy. Gardner articulates quite beautifully his process, which resonates with me. One is tempted to begin by devising for oneself a set of rules on what is to be most important to preserve, what next most important, and so on. But such rules are of little use, at least to me, for what seems most important in one place seems less important in another. And in the end, one has no choice but to let the poetry take one where it will. I never presumed to approximate the poet's complex poetic prosody, which he accomplished with the artistry of a master, but instead, like Gardner, I opted for a predominance of irregular alliteration. Still, I hope to convey the narrative account with a musicality worthy of the endeavor. My prime objective has been to portray the narrative with images as rich as those that I see in my own mind. Scholars disagree about whether or not the poem is complete, because the last stanza breaks from the pattern of 13-line stanzas established by the poem for itself. So much about this poem is a mystery, but I chose to interpret the last line in a manner that brings the vision back to the opening deer drive by drawing a parallel between the king and the deer. This hint of symbolic closure might prove satisfying for some readers. Nevertheless, the uncertain ending of the poem could continue to fuel discourse that goes round and round, much like Fortune's wheel. Summer Sunday, translated by me. On a summer Sunday, I saw the sun early rising to the east of town. Daylight dawned beyond the hills as darkness dispersed. I threw on my threads to the woods I would go, with skilled scent hounds that howled hardly after game. To the grove I hastened with robust huntsmen. Roe deer and dogs ran so rampantly on the ridge that I was inclined to recline under the full foliage of a linden tree. Kennel dogs bayed for the kill so brilliantly as any bell that the deer danced in distress throughout the dell, and all the range resounded. Over all the range resounded the bright blast of bugle, with melodies to draw the dogs and drive the deer in dread. I rose and roamed and saw how the hounds gave chase to targets that darted in the thicket and scattered in the shade, where lords and ladies lingered ready with leashes to lead pedigreed greyhounds, good for speed and gay pursuit. As I arrived close by, their retainers clamored to rally the curs. I rambled on to an unruly river where I wanted to venture across. I strolled by the stream and along the strand. By and by, I found, aground, a boat on the bank nearby. Oh, did I go? Oh, sorry, I missed a line. So I crossed the crossing there. Apologies. I crossed the crossing there in search of happier happenings and wandered away in that wood, friendly folk to find. Friendless still, I lazed on a slope at the base of a hill, where I heard neither horn nor hunt, nor dogs nor deer. Again I walked so far and wide that I was weary of the way. Then I left my quest and settled anew under another tree. And as I saw nearby, in truth, a woman winding a wondrous wheel, revolving clockwise round and round. On that wheel there were, I realized, merry men and mournful men together. I went forth in that field, and there I found the goddess Fortune. Fortune, friend and foe, fairest mistress, fabulous, false, and fickle as all will find. Lady, you turn the wheel to woe, from woe to bliss that will be again, on the running ring of the wheel that runs so round. With only a look from that lady of lovely visage, my delightful diversion was dashed to my dismay. If I dare to declare clearly and completely complaints against that queenly creature's character, She would wrap me in woe so wicked and quick. Nevertheless, I will not yield. Before I leave, I will reveal proper proofs in fitting form. I'll warn you with my whispers. I'll warn you with my whispers, her portents to perceive. A lovelier lady never lived in the land. I willingly went with that deity in divine dress, for I found her so very fair of face in front, along with her golden sash that glowed like an ember. That illustrious lady trapped me in torment before I found the fickle feelings of her heart, with a wonderful wheel that the incomparable creature turned with tenacity. A woman of so much might, such a wonder and master of the wheel, I had never seen with my own sight. So it is veritably so. So it is veritably so, since I saw, as my senses sent to me, a mirthful man, happily hoping for future fortunes, bright as the budding blossom with eyebrows nobly bent, sitting on the wheel that the worthy one wielded on its way. The man seemed well off while the wheel whirled, for he laughed at his leisure, relaxing on the rim. The genial man glanced at me with gracious regard. A merrier man I couldn't recall ever having seen on earth. I gave a greeting to that guy. He said, "You see, my good man, to claim the crown of that courtly king, I am born aloft by birthright. By birthright it will come to me to claim the kingdom of kings as mine by my right. Consent, goddess, to carry me on this wheel. Hoist me high, holy heart. Good fortune, let fly the friendly carousel. May mystical might fight for me to sit as sovereign on that supreme seat." On that supreme seat I saw him next, so satisfied to sit right atop the running ring, crossing knee over knee like a confident king. Debonair and duly decked in cape and crown, his haughty heart prone to impetuous passion. He crossed his legs with insolence. That lord would loathe to lose his lordship. He assumed all the earth was under his almighty sway. I bent to bow before him. He said, "You see, my good man, how I reign by right of fortune's ring, richest in righteousness. Richest in righteousness above queen and knight, who call me king accordingly. Most exalted man of might, at my feet fine folk do fall. I lead a life of luxury, no lord living is equal to me. No duke do I dread, for I rule the realm by royal right." Of that royal right it seems so sad to tell now of how he, having sat on that high seat, was since by sorrow surely sought. For then I beheld his head of gray, frosty such as horehound. All ashen was his complexion, brought by bitter woes. His diadem of diamonds had dropped away. He and his fortunes were helter-skelter in disarray. Seized was his treasure, palace possessions, position, and power. Now in need, in want, naked, and with nothing left to his name. I cried with compassion at his calamity. He wept as well when he spoke of when with acclaim he had been crowned king, then became a wretch. I became a wretch, cast down. Kings who once could call me king, from these friends I fell away. Property, estate, too brief it seems, alas. The lordly life lasts only a little while. Fortune is fickle, first here, henceforth far away. Here happiness, there hardship, once knight, next king, now wretch. Beggared he become, and schooled in sorrow. He lamented the loss of his plentiful prizes and regal prestige. At last, I saw him in more misfortune, final, fated affliction. Briefly king, now a bare body, borne by a bier, driven to death as the deer that trembles in dread and fear. Thank you. Yes, Lauren?
I have a question for Donna. So you said that Mary Magdalene was so important because she spread the word and was the one to witness the resurrection of Christ. Prior to that, do you think she was mentioned so much because of her like newfound faith and character, or because of her wealth and like social standing in the community?
You mean I think that all of the incidences of her being mentioned was to establish her, and I see it more as her establishing her character. She was with Mary and the family of Jesus and the friends, and that's why some do consider her the 13th apostle. And her place as far as being a woman was unusual. And I think that throughout it just establishes her, I see it more as her character. And then her importance, which was, led to be able to be the one to be able to say he is risen and tell the story, be the witness. So does that answer your question?
For Shay, what kind of difficulties did you run into translating some of the words from what seems to be a pretty obscure English dialect to what kind of like crazy swirly paths did you go down to like hunt down the word origins?
Do you mean like literally what was I doing as I was?
Yeah, what kind of resources did
I use?
Yeah.
Well, there are a handful of essays that have been written about Summer Sunday, and a number of those scholars will translate short passages as they're describing parts of the poem, although they did not provide full translations of the poem. So those articles were some of the first places I turned to. Dr. Kimberly Bell, who works at San Luis State University, was also a tremendous support to me, but I spent a lot of time and became very friendly with the Middle English dictionary online from University of Michigan. And if you look up headwords in that dictionary, there are these long lists of possible meanings of each word. And so I would just go through them, and I jot down like a number of words that I thought were possible, and then I work them together after I had, a section complete or a sentence, and see which ones made sense. And as I talked about the weather, I actually did some interesting research into meteorology and what the weather is like in summer in Britain, and because that particular passage really disturbed me. And I also spent a whole afternoon, I think, researching windmills, because that was another piece of evidence that I used to support the idea that the wheel would be going clockwise.
So building off of that question, did
Yeah.
you transcribe the manuscript first and then translate? Or?
No, I used, sorry, I didn't actually mention that out loud, but the handout that you have is the transcription by Thorlek Torvald Peter, which does have a few emendations, but as I looked over it, I decided I agreed with him. And his is the most recent transcription of the poem.
So my question is also for you. I loved this poem, and I loved the translation. And I thought Summer also, it's like, is it not in itself at the apex of the wheel of the year, as it were? So then there's a parallel between the fact that it's summer and the fact that the wheel is turning. And that sort of enhances some of the qualities.
I'm sorry, I wasn't quite catching your question.
It wasn't really a question. It was a reflection.
So you're talking about the summer as being the apex of the year?
Summer is part of the wheel of the season.
Sure, definitely. That makes sense.
Yes. Mine is a combination of question and comment. My takeaway from the poem that you read sort of is the message is that fortune is fleeting and fickle.
Yes.
And that that we cannot, we cannot count on being in a position of power forever and wealth, because it'll be taken away from us.
Yes.
And I like that message, but it's striking to me, given the context of the period in which it's written, that it would seem to me sort of contrary to the notion that there are certain people who stay at below and other people who are above and superior. And that would seem to, that the dukes and lords, those people, they are above.
Yeah.
And
so you're talking about the basic class system existent during the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that, to me, the real overriding message of Fortuna's Wheel is that human beings should not place their happiness in their state in life or anything having to do with fortune's worldly goods, which includes, having a nice house or a wife or children that you're proud of, or even your own personal achievements. All of those things are worldly goods gifted by fortune, and we are to release any attachment that we have to those things for the source of our happiness. And this goes back to, of course, Boethius' Consolation of Philosophy, where the end message is there is only one answer, and the answer is God and love.
Mm-hmm.
So while I understand what you're saying, I think it was understood that that was the overriding message. Yes, Dr. Hill.
I loved all three papers. They were just really wonderful, and really enjoyed them and delighted with the research. My question is for Carolyn, and I was going to wanted to ask if there is that much research on what the monks have contributed to the preservation of literature and the arts and that kind of thing. I know there's research on it, but could you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Do you mean like how monks?
No, in terms of Orderic, and what he did. And I'm sure he's just one representative example of what the monks did in terms of the, working in the scriptorium and that kind of thing. So, if you could just, but I loved what you were saying, is you could just elaborate just a bit more on how that Orderic might be a representative example of maybe what I'm calling the unsung hero. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, this isn't really like my area of expertise per se, but yeah, I think that Orderic and so I also did my dissertation on Henry of Huntingdon and William of Malmesbury. I think all three of them take great pride in the fact that they're very educated. They're very well acquainted with the works that were within their monasteries. William of Malmesbury refers to the Aeneid constantly, and to Lucan and all these classical writers. Really impressive breadth of knowledge. And I do think that they see themselves within inhabiting the monastery as having this responsibility, maybe in more of a communal sense of responsibility of transmitting, scribing, copying, preserving works. And it was, a huge effort, and took really long periods of time to create these books. Is that kind of what you were asking?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Just a minor question for Carolyn. Would you think that, or would you care to speculate on Theory's state of mind? Would he expect his audience to take his story as a true example, or
like concerning its miraculous
fabulous
nature? Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. And actually, I should point out, Orderic and Theory are not contemporaries. Theory was dead before Orderic arrived at Sonnebrühl as an 11-year-old. Theory was a contemporary of William the Conqueror. So that kind of makes it interesting as well. But I think that really, you see these fantastic episodes in a lot of these histories. William of Malmesbury does a lot with this too, and I think that, and some scholars have talked about this, Monica Otter especially talks about invention and fabula within English history writing, and that there's an element that these inventions and fabulae are not, they're not to be taken literally, but within this kind of four-point hermeneutic framework that these monks were taught to interpret, that there are levels of truth embedded at every layer, and so that they might have, you know, more metaphorical or allegorical implications. And that, no, I don't think that Orderic would have necessarily understood this to be something that happened. You know, it's not really claimed in the life of a saint, or it's not, you know, authenticated in that kind of way, like in an Orthodox Christian way, but that he does make a claim to truth by means of these miraculous stories.
That's very interesting. If it were taken literally, one might suggest that it's an example of a near-death experience.
Yeah, and probably there were some people that did take it literally. You know, there's all kinds of stuff that happens like this. William of Malmesbury has very similar, miraculous, died, got to come back to life to amend your ways kinds of stories. So, yeah, they're fun.
So we have time for one more question. Dr. Donna.
This is for Donna, and it's a comment as much as a question. I read an article several years ago that that in Mark and Matthew, the word that was used to describe Mary Magdalene as a witness was in fact the word that was used for somebody that witnessed in the rabbinical court, you know, of law, and that in Aramaic and Hebrew there was a distinction between a legal witness and just observing something,
Right.
and they used the legal witness. But women were not allowed to be legal witnesses, and so that Jesus, or the writers of the gospel, were really transforming the place of women in the society by the use of that word. Unfortunately, the Catholic Church didn't go along with that. It's just my comment. But do you think in these translations that the rhetorical devices that they're doing are sort of also emphasizing a transformative Mary Magdalene, a transformative women, transforming her place?
Definitely. I think that that's what I found was, in fact, I was shocked with, is because you could look at other, you know, disciples or people in the Bible that are mentioned a lot more. And when I actually investigated her and the time she was mentioned, and then started studying the devices as far as the use continually, how they escalated, and, you know, especially towards the end for her, and the fact that she was mentioned with other women, you know, placing their importance also in that. Like I said, there are some that say she was maybe, she could be considered the third disciple as far as that she, you know, stopped what she was doing and followed Jesus. So I think that these proved that she was actually, you know, her role became more important as a woman too. You know, and I thought about that too. And I think that particularly, as I mentioned in the end with Luke and Mark, they had a little different take on her. And the fact that they also used that word as a witness, I hadn't thought about it as a legal witness, you know, in that respect. But now that makes sense, and I would like to look into that with you, because I hadn't seen that.